Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. I feel it's an honor to be invited here, but it's also a challenge to try to say something about this subject. I'm not sure that the title of my lecture really covers what I'm talking about, but I couldn't find anything better, so we'll have to do that. I will start with a preview of what I'm going to talk about, because it is a complex subject, and therefore it's good to follow this old academic tradition of first, when you give a lecture, first you tell people what you are going to talk about, and then you talk about it, and then you sum up by saying what you have talked about. So what I'm going to talk about, the following points. Edmund Husserl's view of spirituality and phenomenology. Husserl, as you know, was the inaugurator of phenomenological movement about 100 years ago. And then go on to present-day examples of Husserl's view, found in philosophy, education, and even, perhaps, in natural science. Third, I go on to critique of present empirical research in spirituality, which leads on to the need for a new epistemology. And I try to formulate the beginnings of such an epistemology with the help of philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was a French phenomenologist, who studied Husserl very deeply, but made his own version of phenomenology, you can say. And also Rudolf Steiner, and some other people. I will look at similarities between Steiner and Merleau-Ponty, and finally give some examples of empirical research which point in the right direction, so to speak. From my point of view, the right. So let's begin with Husserl and look at what he says in the so-called Vienna lecture in 1935, which was entitled Philosophy in the Crisis of European Mankind. It was published posthumously in the so-called Crisis, the Crisis of European Sciences. And this time, 1935, as my Professor Wilenius hinted at, was a time of crisis and chaos in European social life. And people actually thought that this was not just a passing phenomenon on the surface, but some people at least thought it touched the very roots of European civilization. It's a very serious thing. And Husserl, in this lecture, he begins by observing that the natural sciences have been very successful in improving our material living conditions, technology, and so on. But why has the human and the social sciences not contributed to an improvement of social life? Why can we not look to human and social science for a solution to the problems, to the chaos, to the crisis that we are in? Could it be because natural science is objective, as they say, or as Husserl says, supra-subjective? And therefore, natural science is able to find the real causes behind things. Probably many people argue that like that today too. Whereas the human and social sciences remains on a purely descriptive level or interpretive level. They cannot find the physical causes behind the phenomena that they are studying, which they would have to do in order to come up with some models that would help, that would work. But, Husserl says then, what if this way of thinking is part of the very crisis that we are going through? What if it is part of the cause of the crisis? And that is actually the case, according to Husserl. We have been blinded by naturalism, he says, and by the objectivism of natural science. We have been blinded by this idea that true reality is physical and biological at the most. All is sort of, all reality is based on these kind of phenomena. But when human and social science accept that natural science is objective, they lose their power. They sort of have to fall back on their own subjectivity, so to speak, and admit that, okay, we cannot really put up true causal models that would work. Whereas actually objectivism and naturalism are distortions of rationalism, Husserl says. It's a very strong word, you know. Objectivism is the very acme of the peak of rationalism in many people's view. To be rational means to be objective. But Husserl says we have to realize that the spirit exists in itself and for itself, which is another way of saying that it exists both subjectively and objectively. The in itself is objective, the for itself is subjective. But the spirit loses its self-sufficiency if it is naively oriented to the external world, seeking its ground outside itself, as it does in all kinds of reductionism. So the spirit must return to itself and remain purely with itself, to find its ground in itself. This is what Husserl tried to do in his phenomenology. And this, according to him, would help to solve the European crisis. And he says, for instance, a quote here, "It is my conviction that intentional phenomenology has made of the spirit qua spirit for the first time a field of systematic experience and science, and has thus brought about the total reorientation of the task of knowledge." Maybe he's exaggerating a bit about his own importance there, but that's his claim. And there are strong echoes of Fichte in Husserl's thinking here, but he doesn't mention Fichte, and he doesn't mention romantic philosophers, which were also very much into the spirit, reality of the spirit. Instead, he considers Franz Brentano and his idea of intentionality as the first impulse towards a genuine spiritual science. And he took it as a basic starting point for his own phenomenology. So behind each act of consciousness, as he says, you know, our consciousness is full of acts from Husserl's point of view. We're constantly doing things with our consciousness. We're constituting the world. And behind each of these acts, there is a form of intentionality. And intentionality is therefore actually a purely spiritual phenomenon. It's an aspect of consciousness. So then let's leave Husserl and move on to our own times. Question is, can we find something as radical as what Husserl was saying? Can we find something similar today? Yes, I think we can. the spirit of Husserl lives on, so to speak. And there's one interesting paper by a Vienna philosopher, Wolfgang Fasching. It's entitled Consciousness, Self-Consciousness and Meditation, from the Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences journal. And Fasching argues that the mistake of naturalism and objectivism is that they consider consciousness as a phenomenon. But consciousness itself is not a phenomenon on a par with all other phenomena we have in the world. It's more like the condition of existence of every other phenomenon. Consciousness is the taking place of the phenomenality of whatever we experience. It's the taking place of presence. It's the very condition of appearance of everything that appears. And in that sense, it exists independently. It exists in itself, as Husserl would say. Because without consciousness, there is no world, in a way. There's no phenomena. Another example is the rather recent, the rather famous US philosopher Thomas Nagel. In a recent book, Mind and Cosmos, from 2012, he argues rather convincingly that reductive materialism and neo-Darwinism are insufficient to explain consciousness. And he suggests that some kind of panpsychism is more likely to be true than the worldview of scientific materialism. Panpsychism, you know what that everything is sort of permeated by psyche or soul or consciousness, if you like. So consciousness then is a universally present aspect of nature. Consciousness has not evolved out of matter, but has been present from the very beginning of the universe. The third example is another philosopher, a philosopher of science, David Chalmers, who considers consciousness to be a fundamental of nature, which means approximately the same thing as Nagel's view. It means, you know, like matter. Matter is a fundamental of nature. It's just there. We don't ask from where comes matter. It's just there, and then we can study it and analyze it, but we take it for granted that it's just there. And one can do the same with consciousness. Consciousness is just a given. And then we don't have to explain how it arises, because we never find such an explanation. And an interesting example by a professor of theoretical physics in Nature 2005 published a small article called The Mental Universe, where he says that the only reality is mind and observations. To see the universe as it really is, we must abandon our tendency to conceptualize observation as things. The universe is immaterial, mental, and spiritual. Going to the social sciences, there is a book that came recently called Toward a Spiritual Research Paradigm, exploring new ways of knowing, researching, and being, from 2016. And the picture on the frontispiece maybe suggests the dawning of a new science. And in this book, it's an anthology by different authors. And the first chapter is by Oren Ergas, who is an Israeli educational researcher who published many papers on mindfulness in education. And in this chapter, he makes some rather bold statements. He says that a spiritual research paradigm rests on the axiom that spirit is, and views the inner knowing of this fact of life as the place from which this paradigm emerges, and the place to which it gazes to search for meaning. So, it's an axiom that the spirit is. An axiom, you know, is like something a self-evident truth in a way. You don't ask for a proof of an axiom, it's just obvious. It's an obvious knowing of this inner knowing of this obvious fact. And he goes on to say that I know that I happen to be clad in this body and mind, and that I am, which means there is an I that is clad. And my business in life is to get to the bottom of this I, asking who am I? And as a Zen master would add, who is asking? So not only your body but also your mind are kind of clothes, an envelope for your I or your spirit. And Ergas further argues that there is a kind of Kantian meta-paradigm hovering over all the other paradigms that we have, you know, positivism, post-positivism, hermeneutics, constructivism, whatever. Above them all, there is this cloud of Kant's meta-paradigm, which says that spirit is unknowable. There are limits to our knowledge. And human reason and perception are insufficient cognitive instruments for knowing the spiritual world. Now, Ergas here does not mention Rudolf Steiner at all. And I asked him in an email why he didn't do that, and he said he didn't know that Steiner had this very strong critique also of Kant already at the end of the 19th century in his philosophy. And the paradigm is a kind of educational force. It's a kind of silent or immanent pedagogy, some people say, you know. It's, as we grow up in our society, we gradually grow into a world picture without knowing it, so to speak. And one day we sort of realize, oh, this is my worldview, but how did it come about? And so we grow up into in this paradigm which says that we cannot know anything about the spiritual world or the divine or whatever you'd like to call it. So some people claim that this Kantian paradigm, meta-paradigm, is the major reason why most research in spirituality today is focused on subjective experience or states of consciousness. One stays within the realm of experience, and all of this research has really very little consequence for the world. Because of this Kantian meta-paradigm and also because of the Cartesian dualism between mind and body, spirit and matter, this research into spirituality tends to be descriptions of spiritual experiences that people have of all kinds of things. But it stays there, it doesn't mean anything for the world, for the objective world, so to speak. It's just a mapping out of experiences that people have. And you know, people can have a lot of experiences of all kinds, but what does it mean? Does it mean anything for society or the world? And the reason may be this Kantian perspective, the Cartesian, and also even Husserl's phenomenology. You know, when you read Husserl, you learn a lot about all these acts of consciousness, which I talked about, but you know very little about the world. You learn very little about the world when you read Husserl. You learn a lot about consciousness and how it works. So in a way, Husserl is also still has some problems with this subjectivist critique of subjectivism. But let me see. Still, Husserl said, as I said before, the spirit exists both for itself and in itself, both subjectively and objectively. And therefore, for spiritual research, we need an epistemology that goes beyond subjectivism and objectivism. We need an epistemology that sort of bridges these two areas or fields or worlds or whatever you like to call it. And where can such an epistemology be found? Some people have proposed a participatory epistemology as a solution to this problem, what they call a participatory epistemology. And the idea is that knowledge is created by the participation of consciousness in the world. So in processes of perceiving and thinking, consciousness participates both in the natural and the social world. I'm getting lost here among the diyas and this is a quote from one of these people called, his name is Robert Tarnas, who's written a book called The Passion of the Western Mind, which is a rather interesting survey of the whole of Western philosophy from the ancient Greeks to the present impasse of postmodernism or relativism or recent impasse. Some people say postmodernism is now over. I don't know. I'm retired, so I don't follow this too much. And Tarnas sees the forerunners of this kind of thinking, this kind of epistemology, are Goethe, Schiller, Schelling, Hegel, Coleridge, Emerson in the US, and Rudolf Steiner gets a mention too. And he says the human spirit does not merely prescribe nature's phenomenal order, as it does in Kantianism. Rather, the spirit of nature brings forth its own order through the human mind, when that mind is employing its full complement of faculties: intellect, will, emotion, senses, imagination, aesthetics, epiphanic or inspirational, if you like. In such knowledge, the human mind lives into the creative activity of nature. But what is it that we participate in, more precisely? The creative activity of nature sounds nice, you know, but it's a little bit vague. And this is my suggestion here, that we introduce the concept of gestures. We participate in the gestures of the world, of phenomena, knowingly or unknowingly. And we do this very much through our body, through our lived body, as Merleau-Ponty calls it. And I have a simple illustration here to sort of, to illustrate it. I mean, if you look at this figure here, compared to this figure here, you would say this is standing up and this is lying down, wouldn't you? But why do we say this one stands up? Why is this one lying down? It's because we identify with our lived body, we identify with the figure. It's as if we're asking, how would I feel if I was that figure to the left? I would feel like standing up, wouldn't I? Or I would feel like lying down. And this happens subconsciously all the time, I would say. That this is the basis of how we perceive things around us. So our lived body identifies with the gestures of things and beings, living beings and dead beings also. And from that identification, we sort of read the thing and get its meaning. And this notion of gesture appears quite often in Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. Also for Merleau-Ponty, not only living beings make gestures, but also physical objects. Everything in the world sort of speaks, whether silently or with sound. So Merleau-Ponty is then, I would say, also an example of this participatory epistemology that Tarnas and others ask for, because he has this view of that we really participate in the gestures of the world. And also, one of his famous sayings is, I am in the world and the world is in me. Or I and the world are within one another. Because the world obviously surrounds us, we have it around us all the time. But we also surround the world with our consciousness, with our perceptual consciousness. We can embrace the skies in the stars and the smallest grain of sand on the beach. So consciousness and world are sort of polarity in unity. This yin-yang symbol you all know about, this black and white fishes. It's really a good example of a polarity in unity. Consciousness and world, you can take it. They meet and embrace each other, but they are part of one whole. Now, Merleau-Ponty does not speak explicitly about meditation, but meditation is, like, as it were, implicit in his philosophy. As one of his interpreters, David Lowe, has noted that it is as if Merleau-Ponty asks his readers to step back, to loosen our bonds with the world, that is, to reflect and to watch the meanings that are formed in the body's lived encounter with the world fly up like sparks from a fire. So in the practice of meditation, especially the mindfulness of body and breath, which is a basic form of Buddhist meditation, it is possible to enter more deeply into the lived body experience. And you know, the automatic thought stream that commonly occupies our heads can sort of subside. You can come to a point of inner quiet, inner stillness, and in that state, the more subtle qualities of things and beings can be revealed to you. And when this happens, as the quote says, we loosen our bonds with the world. We are no longer so tied up with the world. And we reflect, and the meanings arise spontaneously by themselves, so to speak. So mindfulness of breath and body slows down perception. This is another key point I would like to emphasize as important in all spiritual research methods. We have to learn how to slow down our perception. Nowadays we have a lot of slow movement, like slow food, and slow learning. So now I'd like to introduce slow perception. And it's actually really already a part of the phenomenological method. It is what is called epoche, where you try to disregard everything you know about something and look at it as if for the first time. And Maxine Sheets Johnstone, who is a very interesting philosopher and phenomenologist, especially she's focused on dance and movement. She says this about the epoche, that you have to let the experience of the strange, that is, the thing, whatever it is you study, you make it sort of as if the first time, that is, it becomes strange. And you let this experience resonate for some time. And even then, you must return to it many times to pinpoint its aspects, character, its quality, in descriptively exacting ways. So mindfulness of breath and body cultivates the lived body as a thinking, perceiving being. The lived body as our primary research instrument. You know, Goethe said, the most perfect instrument for research of nature is the human being. But we have to cultivate these abilities, of course. So come now to Rudolf Steiner. First of all, about the senses. The senses obviously participate in the world, and Steiner was very often quoted Goethe, who said that the eye was created by the light for the light. It means that the eye is already part of the world, and when we see, the eye participates in the light and in the colors of the world. So that's about the sense perception, but then he was also talking a lot about thinking. And in his philosophy of freedom, he says, for instance, that in thinking, we get hold of a flap of the cosmic world process. A flap is like this corner. So we participate in the cosmic world process. Or thinking welds our separate individuality into one whole with the cosmos. But thinking here is not the same as having thoughts. We all have thoughts all the time. But thinking is more like the space between two thoughts. What happens between two thoughts? Have you ever asked yourself that? Between two thoughts, there is a pure activity of thinking, the pure thinking, the thinking as pure spiritual activity, as Steiner calls it. And out of this stream of pure activity drops thoughts as kind of crystallizations as the stream moves on. So this activity of pure thinking goes on most of the time subconsciously, but through meditation we can enter this stream more consciously. So that was a little bit about Steiner and a little bit about Merleau-Ponty. And now I'd like to point to some intersections between Steiner and Merleau-Ponty. I call it intersections, not similarities, because it's more like when two roads intersect, you know. One is going one way, the other is going another way. And it's the same with Steiner's philosophy is going one way and Merleau-Ponty's philosophy is going another way. But some points they cut each other. And the first point is that for both of them, knowledge is not a copy of reality, it should say there. Could say the world also, but more precise. Knowledge is not a copy of reality. Merleau-Ponty says that phenomenology is an act of bringing truth into being. And Steiner could have said exactly the same thing. Steiner talks about how we create knowledge, and when we create knowledge, we do not make a copy of a reality that is already existing, but we create something new, and that, together with our experience, makes reality. So reality is not a given. It is, as Einstein said, or even, reality is not a given, it's a task. It's the task of the human being to achieve reality. Another intersection is the mode of existence of consciousness and the I. We already talked about Merleau-Ponty saying, I am in the world and the world is in me. Steiner, for his part, is a bit more complex, but you could read him in the same direction. He gave a lecture once at the philosophy conference in Bologna, 1911, where he talked about the nature of the I. And he says that we have to distinguish between a central I and a peripheral I. The central I is what we normally experience as I. It's because we are in the center of the world, so to speak. It's a central I, it's somewhere here or around here. But that I is really just a mirror, a reflection of the real I, which is the peripheral I, which lives in the world. Our true self, so to speak, is outside, not inside. So the central I could refer to, could be the same as what Merleau-Ponty says when I am in the world. And the peripheral I would be that the world is in me. Third point of intersection is the nature of intersubjectivity. And it's about losing oneself in the other person. Merleau-Ponty says in one of his texts, when I speak or when I understand, I experience the presence of others in myself, and I experience myself in others. A presence which is the cornerstone of the theory of intersubjectivity. So, I am in you and you are in me, so to speak. But Steiner has a bit more complex view, because he agrees that we are within another, but that is only one phase of the communication between two people, or one moment, so to speak, because what actually happens is that we go to sleep in the other person when we listen, but then just a moment later we wake up and take a distance. So for Steiner there is this continuous oscillation between falling asleep in the other, waking up and being myself, back and forth. So it's not completely the same as Merleau-Ponty, but it's very similar in that sense. So if it is true that the possibilities of the future lie in the area of social interaction, as I read Professor Marco Villenius said somewhere, we need a deeper understanding of how social interaction works, maybe. And then we must also consider the ever stronger tendency towards individualization that characterizes our Western world particularly, but is spreading all over the planet. And Steiner warns us that if this tendency is not counterbalanced by an active interest in other human beings, it will eventually lead to a kind of war of all against all, because each individual will care only for himself and have no empathy with other people. Two final intersections. The thing about gesture, we already talked about gestures in Merleau-Ponty. Steiner actually also, when you read him with this in the backhead, so to speak, this idea of gesture, you find that he also very often refers to gestures. And of course you have the art form of eurythmy, which is all gestures, isn't it? And these gestures mean something. And finally, something a bit more complex maybe, that is that the object of research is the everyday world. You know, it's especially Steiner does his spiritual research, but he's not sort of leaving this world in order to go to some other domain. The spiritual world is here. It's right here, right now, except we cannot see it so clearly. We don't have the organs. And the same you could say about Merleau-Ponty, that he's really studying this world here, but because he is so, in a way, open and honest in his way of experiencing things, he comes to the very similar results. Nevertheless, Steiner, of course, also talks about the supersensus world, the world beyond our normal senses. Actually, he talks about das sinnlich-übersinnliche, which is the sensus supersensus. So it's as if there is a level where the sense world and the supersensus world blend, so to speak. And this is the lowest level of the spiritual world, which is the world of etheric forces. And these etheric forces, as you probably, many of you already know, that it's an old idea. We have it in other spiritual traditions, like what is called qi or qi in the Far Eastern spirituality, and even traditional Chinese medicine is an important concept of the qi, the life force. And in the Indian yoga it's called prana. And the sign for qi in Chinese is composed of two signs. It's atmosphere and inner energy. These two put together is a qi. And that's interesting because it's also both subjective and objective. The atmosphere is objective, it's out there. And the inner energy is more subjective. And so it transcends, again, this subject-object division. Atmosphere is related to weather phenomena. Inner energy is related to life energies of the lived body. And the weather affects our minds and our bodies too. Some people get a headache when there is thunder weather coming, or, these kind of things. And the weather is actually an important factor in traditional Chinese medicine, something you have to consider. And according to traditional Chinese medicine, qi is not only an energy, it's also an information. It also has information. It's not the information that you find on the internet, but it's, some kind of information anyway. It's like, I think it is related to what is said about some animals can sense the coming of an earthquake before it happens. They can sense it, and they can run away to get safe. And actually, in the tsunami 2004, some indigenous people on the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean saved themselves by running up into the mountains before the tsunami came, because they sensed in the atmosphere that something was going to happen. So there's a kind of information there. And it's interesting it's like, I feel a disturbance in the force. As Darth Vader says. And there are some German phenomenologists who are going into this area of atmosphere, studying the atmosphere. Gernot Böhme. Now I don't know if I have put him up here. Yes. Gernot Böhme is a German philosopher who's published a book about atmospheres. Phenomenology, natural and social atmospheres. And then there is recently a Japanese man who did a dissertation in Germany about Erfahrungen des Qi, experiences of Qi, as they are described in a famous Japanese novelist. So Qi is actually a very common word or concept used in Japanese, everyday life. So they have kept something of that old intuition, or what you'd like to call it, about that there is some energy which is invisible and alive, but we cannot see it directly. Now, the remarkable thing about this idea of the Qi is that it's a concept that can be used both by physicians and painters. So artists and doctors can share the same language. Because in traditional Chinese painting and Japanese painting also, one talks about the quality of the Qi that is expressed in the painting. And it's as if the painting of the birds there, what is it that makes it good according to this view? I mean, it's very expressive. You can sort of feel the movement of the birds. And the artist's brush has sort of captured the essence of the movement, the essence of the gesture of this bird, and let that gesture flow into his hand as he paints. And this painting here is the Chinese sign for thunder. And that you can feel also that there is a kind of thunder energy in that painting. Huh? So this is called the key gestalt in Japanese. They talk about the key gestalt of a painting. The gestalt of the chi, the gestalt of the etheric forces that has gone into the gesture of the painting. Now we're coming to some empirical research. We have some minutes left. I'm not going to go into this, I'm just going to sort of point it out, most of it at least, that we have of course a lot of research into mindfulness and meditation nowadays. And it is also often related to new developments in phenomenology called neurophenomenology and microphenomenology. Then we have, for over 20 years, there's been an international journal of children's spirituality, which is an interesting phenomenon in itself, although the research there is usually of this kind of subjectivistic character that I talked about in the beginning. It's a lot about children's experiences, but stops there, so to speak. Architecture. Marco Villenius, you had some nice architecture on your pictures. And architecture is, of course, full of gesture, isn't it? You can find gestures everywhere. And Steiner was, for Steiner, architecture was a very important thing, because he even said that we cannot expect people to understand or experience the spiritual world unless we change our forms of architecture. And so there has been, in Waldorf education, there has been, as you know, many schools try to build their own buildings in these strange ways, more or less. And there was Christian Rittelmeier, is a German educational researcher. He's retired now, and he was very much inspired by Waldorf education. He was a professor at, I don't remember, some university now. And they did some very interesting small-scale studies of how students experience school architecture. And they let a small group of children, maybe around 10, 11, 12 years old, look at photographs of school buildings. And they showed a picture of one school, you know, which was very square, very heavy, cement or beton, how do you call it, cement, beton block, with rows of square windows, all the same size, one row after another. And when the students looked at that kind of picture, very many of them expressed dislike, said, I don't like this building. And then they also measured the pupils of the eyes. And they found that the pupils of the eyes closed as they looked at those pictures when they expressed negative feelings. So it was not just an expression of their mind, so to speak, when they say I don't like, but their whole body, the lived body, took a distance, an antipathy, because this kind of shrinking of the pupils is correlated with an antipathic feeling. And you can sort of read that gesture. What does that gesture say? It says, it gets darker, huh? It gets dark, or I close myself. And you can imagine if many students in that school have that kind of feeling, subconscious, how does that affect the atmosphere of the school? There was another example with toys, but I don't go into that, it takes too long time. Just mention finally here the Gross National Happiness Project in Bhutan. Have you heard about that? Instead of measuring the GNP, is it called? GNP? GNB. Yeah. The king of Bhutan decided that all living beings want to be happy. That's a Buddhist premise, you know, and Bhutan is a Buddhist country, so he says, let's measure happiness instead of money and production. And this is not really a research project, of course, but it's based on research. It's based on research into mindfulness, into well-being and happiness, kind of psychological research. And it's an example of what can be done in the social or political sphere on the basis of spiritual insight. So, that was the final point, unless you want also the summary. I think maybe just spend a quick minute on this summary. We began with Husserl claiming that the spiritual world is a reality in itself, and only on the basis of this insight can human and social science become practically relevant for social life. And although there are already research into spirituality, it tends towards subjectivism. In order to overcome this subjectivism, we need another epistemology, which I call participatory epistemology. And we find such epistemologies in Rudolf Steiner and Merleau-Ponty, where participation is really a link between these two. And there are also already examples of socially relevant research, more or less relevant. I don't have to repeat that again, I think. So to come to the conclusion, phenomenology can become a fully developed spiritual science by using contemplative practices or forms of meditation in order to participate more intensely in the gestures of the world. Thank you.